Hello, everyone. I'm YJ, moderator for the Thick Data session, and I really want to welcome everyone. So this year, the World Knowledge Forum's theme is humanities, techno Big Bang, humanities on the shoulders of big giants. And when we think about our session, I think we are probably one of the sessions which really focuses on the humanities. A lot of other sessions will focus on the AI and ChatGPT, and which is basically the big giants. But what we want to focus on is definitely those side of the things are very important, but we need to have a balance on the humanities side. So we are very proud to have this session, and thank you for everyone for coming here from an early morning, which is not easy for everyone, but it's a full house and really appreciate it. Okay, so before we start the session, I want to start with introducing ourselves. We have really renowned guests who are the experts in the thick data. So we'll have maybe 15 seconds each to introduce ourselves. So let's start with Mikkel.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. My name is Mikkel. I'm a partner at Red Associates, which is a consulting firm out of New York and Copenhagen and Paris. We use the humanities and the social sciences to advise large corporations on what to do, where to go next. And I've spent, I guess, the last decade and a half writing and talking about thick data.
Thank you, Mikkel. Laura, are you on the Zoom? You can
Wonderful. Go. Hello, good morning, everyone. I am Laura Krajewski. I am a partner with Deloitte Digital, and I have spent my entire career really passionately in this space, leading global thick data practices, human truths practices for many of the world's largest brands, and it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you this morning.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, so I introduced myself very briefly. I'm an anthropologist who became a businessman, and after I spent into the business area, it has been already 23 years. I worked in global companies like McKinsey, Blizzard, Google, Philip Morris, and recently I wrote a book on thick data, which is the theme of our session. Okay, so with that, we'll go into how we are structuring the whole session. I will have a maybe 10-minute presentation about the concept of thick data, because the concept is not really familiar with everyone. So I will go through the concept, but not theoretically, but more with the cases, so that you understand what the thick data is. And then the next 10 minutes will be presented by Mikkel here, who will talk about more in-depth cases which Red Associates worked on. And we have really fantastic cases we can talk about. After those 10-minute presentation, we'll go into the fireside chat. That's when three of us will have a discussion, but at the same time, focusing more on the Laura's experience. She has a great experience at Google in the human truth and the Deloitte. So it'll be a very much full, rich content we are going to talk about. After those fireside chat, maybe we'll save maybe 10 minutes at the end to have a Q&A from the floor. And we'll have a really packed agenda, so I will just start right now. Okay, so thick data, uncovering the hidden desires of consumers. We talk about a lot of big data and the AI and ChatGPT, but we are going to talk about thick data, which will balance it today. So before we go into the concept of thick data, we need to understand what the big data is. And everyone understands what it is. And kind of a definition of the big data, which is early definition, is the data sets with the sizes beyond the ability of commonly used software tools to capture, curate, manage, and process data within a tolerable elapsed time. Okay, so who will be probably one of the companies which are very good at using big data? When I was working at Google, a lot of Googlers were talking about Netflix, because Netflix is very good at in terms of using data. And 10 years ago, when Netflix started to upload all the videos on the cloud, they started to see a pattern from the big data they have, which is a binge watching. You know what the binge watching is. You go through the whole content, whole series in just one stop. And the problem with the big data is big data tells you what and how much, but they don't tell you why. So they were very curious. Is it a good thing? Is it the trend which will stay? And then what they did is they hired anthropologists. What they did was anthropologists always go into the field and live with them to experience the consumers. So what they did, they went to their homes. So they did a participant observation of the Netflix hardcore fans, living with them, eating with them, watching the TV together, watching the Netflix together, having a joke together, and so forth. What they found out was very interesting. First, a lot of hardcore consumers were watching Netflix during the weekends, and they went through the whole season in one get-go. So Netflix actually knew this because of the big data, but they didn't really wanted to know why, and they were actually worried about this trend in some sense. Why? Because in the US, there's a concept of couch potato. You're sitting on the couch, eating the potato chips, mindlessly watching TV. So they were really going deep with the consumers. Is it a good experience or a bad experience? And they said, I love it. Because weekends I work during the weekdays. I have my free time, my time. During that time, I watch the contents which I want to watch from the start to the end. This is a bliss to me. So they found out it's a very positive experience. But Netflix has another concern. If they know the ending, are they going to keep staying in our subscription services? And that's a spoiler. So what they found out is, of course, I'm not going to tell people about the ending, but in case I do, my friends and family's reaction is, oh, is it that good? Maybe I should watch it. What is it called? It's a word-of-mouth marketing. So they found out these things, anthropologists, and then reported back to the headquarters. Headquarters had to make a business decision. And they were at the crossroad of launching their original series, which is House of Cards. So what they did was, with this big data and the trends they found out in the big data, they decided to drop the whole contents at the same time. Why? First, that's how our hardcore fans are watching our contents. Second, it's a very positive experience. Third, it can actually create a word-of-mouth marketing. Fourth, nobody else is doing it. It's not an easy decision because if you look at the one episode out of usually 16 episodes, it costs about $1 or 1.5 million US dollars. It's a lot of money. But their business model is a subscription business. So if people watch it, the binge watching it, on average, it takes about 2 days or 7 days to go through everything. Then they might leave. So it's a very natural fear they might have. But they courageously made a decision that we will follow what we found out and then see how it happens. What happened? After they dropped the whole season of House of Cards, 2 million subscribers increased in the US, globally 1 million. With the success, they continued this new business model, and then last quarter, the total number was 232 million subscribers in the world. So this is where I want to throw the question again. The big decision they made, is it because of the big data? Or is it because of the thick data they found out? So I'm going to talk about what the thick data is. Now that you have a story, you will have a little bit more understanding of thick data. The definition would be data that explains the context and meaning of the real human behaviors. If we can compare big data and thick data, that it becomes much more clear. If you think about the big data actually tells you what and how much. But thick data tells you context, and it also tells you why consumers behave like that. The big data is usually quantitative data, but the thick data is a qualitative data. Sometimes it's difficult to quantify. Big data is through the machine learning, but thick data, the human learning can identify these learnings. Lastly, Big data talks about the past and present, but thick data can tell you future. Why? Because you know the answer to why question. Okay, now that I talked about the US case, I will talk about my own case and then give it to Mikhail to talk about the consulting cases. I was working at Blizzard as a managing director. And as you know, Blizzard makes a lot of hardcore games, StarCraft, World of Warcraft, Diablo, all the PC games. When I was MD, luckily we had a card game coming out, which is Hearthstone. The card game looks like this. You play against your player, and then the powerfulness of your card deck makes you win. When the Mike Moheim, who is actually created Blizzard and the CEO of the Blizzard, not right now, but in the past, came to Korea in person to tell us about this new game coming out. On the left side, there's Mike Moheim, that's the CEO of Blizzard. On the right side, me, younger. And the rest of the people are the StarCraft 2 players. This is pictures taken at the BlizzCon, which is a very famous annual event for the Blizzard. So Mike Moheim came to Korea, told us about this exciting game about the Hearthstone, and then he told us this game will be on PC and iPad. What was the reaction from me and my managers and the whole employee of the Blizzard Korea? How about mobile games? This is the game we actually have. We can actually put it onto the mobile. The thing is, Mike Moheim and the people, developers in the US, never thought about putting this on the mobile platform. They thought this game, you cannot put into the mobile and then it's too small to play. So we were really pushing back, saying that this is the game you need to have on mobile. If you do, then you need to have Android platform first, because that owns the 90% of the market share in Korea at the time, and also iOS. He was a little bit hesitant and went to China. Chinese Blizzard China people said the same thing. That's when he moved, because unfortunately, Korea is 5% of the whole Blizzard revenue. If Korea pushes for it, they kind of wonder. But if China pushes for it, definitely go. Okay, so after the trip, Mike Moheim went to the headquarters and told the developer team. Originally, 15 people created the Hearthstone, added 15 more people. Took about 1 year to port the game into the mobile game. And finally, the game came out. Okay, so with the game coming out, what was the performance of Blizzard Korea? On the first day, the download in the iOS, we took #1 position in 1 day. In the Android platform, it became #2. In 6 days, we became top 10 revenue generator. After 1 month, amazing thing happened. As I told you, Blizzard Korea's revenue is only 5% of whole Blizzard global. Out of that, US is the biggest market. After 1 month of launching Hearthstone Mobile, Blizzard Korea revenue became half of US revenue. This has never happened before. Okay, so here I'm going to raise another question. How come in the US, Irvine, where the smartphone was actually created by Apple, have never thought about launching this game on the mobile? On the other hand, Korean users, employees, and me was pushing that on the mobile. There might be a lot of different reasons, but I find the answer from the culture in the US, which is driving culture. This is the traffic photo in LA. And traffic in the LA is so bad, there's a movie called Falling Down by Michael Douglas, who was pissed off the traffic and then started killing people on the streets. I think it was popular, but anyway, the point is the traffic is bad. And it takes about 1.5 hours to go to work and come back home. So usually people spend about 3 hours on the street. I would bet that 95% of the drivers on the photo will be driving alone. They are not driving with other people. Then how are you going to use the smartphone? On the other hand, in Korea, everyone is looking at the smartphone only. So this is the difference in the engagement with the smartphone. For the Blizzard Korea employees and me, we already had a thick data in our mind. And big data was already there because although the PC game and the PC game was the main driver in the US market, at that time, in Korea, mobile games were already picking up. You already started to see the big data patterns. And me and my employees already have that big data in our mind and really thinking that this will work. And that really worked, right? Okay, so I'm going to wrap up with the framework so that you can have this framework while listening to Mikhail's story. So am I only pushing for the big data? No. If you have the scalability of the data on the x-axis, depth of the insight on the y-axis, usually big data has a lot of scalability, but it lacks the insight. The thick data, on the other hand, has a pretty much small set of data, but it goes deep and it provides the depth of insight. That what I'm suggesting is you need to get the consumer insights from the thick data, which will become a very deep hypothesis. Compare with the big data so that you check out and prove or disprove whether that pattern happens in the data, big data. Then, if you have a balance of these two things and then really develop the actionable data, that's what I call smart data. And this is what we did at Google, Human Truth Team. And Laura on the screen will explain later how at the Google, we actually combined big data and big data to come out with the solution and suggestions to the clients. Okay, now you might wonder that, okay, I kind of got the thick data, so how do we collect the thick data? That's why I actually created thick framework. First, you need to have a tolerance. You need to develop a tolerance for unfamiliarity, which I talked about the Blizzard case. Putting game on the mobile was very unfamiliar for them, but when they open up the opportunity to that, they have a very different business impact. Second, hidden desire. A lot of times consumers don't tell you directly about the hidden desire. You need to find it out through participant observation. Informants. In terms of doing so, you need to really create a group of people who has a lot of deep insights, the true fans of your products and services, and people who know your products in and out. Those can become informants for your thick data collecting. Context. You need to have a focus on the holistic context rather than what consumers say, as I have explained. And last is the kindred spirit, which is basically having an empathy with the consumers. So if you add one first words, that's a thick. That's why I call it thick framework. So this is the very simple the framework I created, and then I'm going to put that in your mind before I leave the mic to Mikhail so that he can tell us about very interesting US cases. Mikhail?
Thank you very much, YJ. So I thought what I could try to share is, now that YJ has explained a little bit about what thick data is, why it matters, I'll try to explain what it looks like. Because how do you actually go about collecting this when it's this sort of context? In a certain way, it's the water that we all swim in, right? But first, maybe I should just explain a little bit more about who I am and where all this comes from. So as I mentioned before, I'm a partner at a company called Red Associates. We are a strategy consultancy that helps business leaders make decisions about pretty much anything in the world that has high stakes. And we do that based on the social and human sciences. And it's interesting, at a conference where, as YJ mentioned, we're talking about technology, we're talking about AI, we're talking about what big data can do. Really, Red Associates, we shouldn't exist, right? Because we should be able to make all these decisions with AI, with data. That's the common refrain right now. But I'm very happy we do exist. And we're not the only ones doing this kind of work. We work for a range of the world's largest companies basically trying to inform strategy with context, with thick data. And it's interesting because as the world has gathered more and more data, as big data has been on the rise, so has the need for thick data. It's very, very clear, the companies we work for, it's almost like the more data they have, the more they need the anthropologists and others to contextualize that data. So if you look at companies like Netflix that YJ mentioned, or Meta, or Google, or other companies that supposedly have all the data, they are also some of the biggest employers of anthropologists and social scientists in the world. And our core idea is really this sort of premise that if you want to understand people, you need to understand their worlds. You need to understand what's around them. That there's so much we can do to ask people what they think, to try to understand what's inside of our heads, and that's a lot of the focus of when we say take a walk in your customer's shoes. That's actually not what I'm talking about when I talk about thick data. Thick data is what's between us. It's culture, it's moods, it's discourse, it's all the stuff that's sort of in the air, and if you want to see it, you have to look at things outside of ourselves. You can't just ask us about it. You can't just say, how do you want to watch your movies, to YJ's point before. Rather, you have to observe and see what's going on. I want to show you something, which is when you think about what does thick data actually look like. This sort of grainy image of a somewhat beaten up shoe is perhaps one of the most valuable pieces of thick data ever collected. It's a piece of thick data collected by some of my colleagues at Red in collaboration with Lego many years ago, back in 2005. And why does that matter? Well, Bloomberg years later said you could say a worn out sneaker saved Lego. This one piece of data, which was this shoe that we got from a young 12-year-old boy in Germany, really sort of gave an explanation for what the company should do going forward. And to understand what I mean, we probably have to go back in time a little bit, because I know that today, most of you might think of Lego as a hugely successful company, biggest toy company in the world, one of the strongest brands, and so on. But it wasn't always like that. When we started working with Lego in 2004, they had huge deficits, and they'd had deficits for years. They had basically been really threatened by what was going on in the toy industry, which they kept trying to launch new kinds of toys to try to catch sort of consumer sentiment. So they would say, oh, we need to sort of do what Mattel does with Barbie, and let's go in that direction. Or, PlayStation and other things that come out, and they have, it's YJ's point before, they have games that can hook you, and you just open it up and you can play. That's amazing. We need to do that. No one wants to just sit and put Lego bricks together forever. That seems dumb. So they tried line extension after line extension, new product idea after new product idea, and they were all failing. And then a new CEO came in, and he asked us to come and basically sort of take a fresh look at what was going on. So we went out and we did a big study of how do kids play? So rather than asking the normal business question, which is how do we sell more toys, we tried to understand what is it that's going on when kids play? Why do they play? What is play nowadays? And that's where we come back to the shoe. So we saw a lot of things in our research. And we asked kids a lot of questions, we played with them, and so on. And then there's this one 12-year-old boy in Germany who, when we asked him, what's your most prized possession? And we sort of expected that he would then show us one of his favorite toys, or maybe one of his computer games, and so on. And instead, he showed us this shoe. And we were sort of like, okay, that's odd. What's so special about this shoe? And he explained to us, well, this is the shoe I've worn as I've been practicing kickflips on my skateboard in my backyard for the past several years. And I'm really, really proud that I can now finally do a kickflip. And if you look at the shoe, you can see the sort of scuff marks on the top of the shoe rather than the bottom of the shoe. And in his world, that was basically evidence of the thousands of kickflips he'd been doing on a skateboard in his backyard. So we looked at that and we said, that's interesting. So of all the things you could say that's sort of the most important thing to you, you're pointing to something that's basically proof that you have just been doing the same thing over and over again for ages in your backyard. And what it shows is that kids don't want toys that are easy, necessarily. They don't just want toys that like are right there for you and open up a world, like a lot of computer games do. They want to be challenged. They want to be able to show off their skills. They want toys that are as complex as the world around them. They want to be pushed out of their comfort zone, and they want hierarchy. These are all sort of insights that really sort of ran counter to the classic idea of toys should be fun. It should be all about just joy and fun and so on. We said, no, actually, toys can be hard. And that sort of core idea has powered Lego for 15 years since then, right? So once they had that, we could see, oh, you should cut all these line extensions. You should go back and just focus on the brick. And then that core idea of building bricks, putting things together, that's the core DNA, right? You can take that and you can make a movie around it. You can take that and you can make computer games around it, but it should all be focused on this fundamental premise that play should challenge you. So that's an example of a single piece of thick data that shows you a new world as an executive. But then I want to show you something very, very different, because of course you can collect thick data with kids and so on, but to this question of how do we then combine thick data and a thick data understanding of the world with big data? Well, a few years ago we did sort of a fun little study to try and sort of put the combination of big data and thick data to the test. So we decided to take on what is one of the biggest sort of data science challenges today. But we decided to look at credit card fraud. So credit card fraud is a billion-dollar problem for banks across the world. And at the time when we did the study, it was a rapidly growing problem because you had new chips and so on coming out that weren't quite sort of in consumers' pockets yet. So there were not all the safety features that we have today. And the banks had armies of data scientists basically trying to find fraudsters by looking at the transaction data, right? So they look at your transactions and they try to find patterns and say, oh, that transaction seems fraudulent. You bought something in a different country or in a regular pattern, that's likely to be a credit card fraud. And we said, well, okay, great. That's the classic approach. We can ask the big data what it can tell us about the fraudsters and we can go down that route. But what if we turn that problem on its head for a second? What if we ask the fraudsters what they can tell us about the big data that we should be looking at? So we went out and we spent time with people who commit credit card fraud. So that means spending a lot of time in slightly shady warehouses and other places across the US. It means spending a lot of time on the dark web. And it's, by the way, something that's a fairly established practice if you look at the sociology of deviance and so on. So it's something that in academia is common practice, but in a business world is not very common practice. And it's interesting because the folks who commit credit card fraud, they are actually proud of what they do. They want to talk about it. So of course they don't want to talk about it to the FBI. So you have to give them some assurances that you're not going to give them away and so on. But they are proud to actually share and give a window into the world that they're part of. So we spent a lot of time with credit card fraudsters across the US, both online and in person. Some of them were in sort of little fraud rings, you could say. Others were sort of loan operators. And the common theme that we saw with all of these folks is, I should mention that the folks we looked at were basically people who would buy credit card data on the dark web. So they would buy, let's say, 10,000 credit cards that had been stolen in a hack somewhere, and then they would try to use them, right? And you would think of credit card fraud, you think of like, oh, that's sort of glamorous. They're probably driving around their Ferraris, or it's big organized crime. That's not the case. 90% of credit card fraudsters are basically folks who are sort of struggling to get by. And what you see when you meet them is that credit card fraud is a grind. It's really, really hard work. It's basically folks who are fairly smart, gifted folks who grew up in not great circumstances and therefore feel like they have a choice between working at McDonald's or selling drugs. And they feel like selling drugs seems high risk and takes me down a path that I don't want to go in my life. McDonald's, that's too much of a grind. So here's this thing that's right in between. But again, it's really hard work, and people see it as really, really risky. And once you understand that, like the whole sort of calculus around fraud changes, right? Because you realize, so what we need to do is not necessarily just to sort of find them and identify each fraudulent transaction. If we just make it more difficult, then it won't be worth it anymore. So there are lots of things you can do to make fraud more difficult that won't necessarily catch the fraudster, but will just make it more complicated. And then we sort of looked at, okay, great, so what does that look like? Well, how can we make it more complicated? What are the pain points for someone who commits credit card fraud? And there are a lot. One of the ones that was sort of more significant was that we could see that these folks, as long as they're sitting behind a computer screen, they feel safe. They feel like, you guys can throw any kind of algorithm at me, and a month later, I'll be one step ahead. I'll come up with something new. I'll come up with a workaround, right? But there's one element of their process where they can't hide behind the computer screen anymore. And that's when they've bought goods online that they need to pick up somewhere. Someone has to go and physically pick up those goods. How do they do that? So that's the one piece of their process where there's sort of a limited set of options, right? So what do fraudsters do? They send it to abandoned homes. They send the goods to P.O. boxes. They send the goods to homes of folks who are out of town. Particularly the abandoned home one was at the time the sort of most popular. And once we saw that, we were like, oh, but that's an easy thing for us to fix. All the folks who've been fighting credit card fraud have just been looking at the transaction data. So all we need to do is we need to give them access to a new data set. So rather than arming the data scientists just with all the transaction data about what you buy, we need to also give them access to real estate data about where those goods going, right? And that data exists. So we partnered up with Zillow and Trulia and other data providers that could pull in data on, is that home for sale? Is that home abandoned? And so on. And suddenly the quality of the algorithms massively increased, right? And the lesson here, of course, is not that the data scientists are dumb and the humanities folks are smart. It's that the data scientists had been looking at one data set, right? Their world was the transaction data that they'd been given. And when you sort of open up and look at the context for a second, all of a sudden you realize that's not the whole universe of data, right? There's a world outside of that you can pull in. So anyway, that's two examples of what thick data looks like in practice. If you want to understand more about thick data, there's a bunch of resources, books and articles and so on this website that I'm very happy for you guys to check out, including a really, really good book that I highly recommend that YJ just wrote.
My book is written in Korean. Did you read my book? Sorry,
there's this thing called big data that gives you Google Translate.
I'm just kidding. Okay, thank you very much, Mikhail, about really interesting cases. The Lego was very symbolic, and the credit card fraud case is really, it's like a detective story. That's very, very interesting. So hopefully you got the sense of what the thick data is and how we can utilize it. We'll have the fireside chat. So can you put Laura on the screen? Great, so we'll start having a discussion. And now that we heard about the cases, what the concept of thick data is, I want to start a question about your experience at Google. Because Google is the company where they have probably all the data in the world, in some sense. But why did Google invest in human truth? What was the need for the Google to kind of invest in the thick data, finding out thick data? And if you can give us some insight about why, and then what kind of projects you have done at Human Truth, that would be very, very interesting.
Absolutely. So thank you, YJ and Mikhail. It's Great to be here with all of you. So yes, as a bit of background, as YJ shares, I've been doing this for 25 years globally with some of the biggest brands. And YJ and I had the privilege to meet and work together at Google when I built Google's global human truths practice from the ground up with an incredible team that I'm still proud of to this day in terms of the work that we did. And what we're really doing, when we're saying human truths, it means thick data, this conversation we're having here today. And it was all around how do you help brands deeply understand their consumers or customers and how to uniquely and powerfully connect with them. One of the things I've learned in my entire career, I've seen it, what drove YJ, to your point, the demand and the need for this at Google with all of its data was that every single client, every single brand and business out there has a greatest consumer or customer challenge or opportunity. Whether you are entering a new market, losing share, trying to win with a new generation, trying to expand off of a succeeding product, and really what we were striving to do with Google Human Truths was to help the world's biggest global brands, marketers out there, tackle their greatest global consumer challenges or opportunities. And what we did is we brought together, and this, through the very similar to how Mikkel and YJ are talking about, is bringing together and fusing the power of big data and thick data to deeply unlock something fresh, new, provocative, and original that the business needed to understand about their consumers today. And I think that is something that's a really critical point in understanding. There's the balance of always studying your consumers and having lots of data and insights from multiple perspectives in your business. But business is a creative, strategic act. We are all out there trying to create winning propositions, products, and competitive advantage in our business. And so what human truths and the power of thick data is, it helps you distill down through all of your big data and thick data married together to get to a crystallized moment of clarity, real power. What does our business need to know right now to be really credible and to connect with relevance with our consumers? And one of the things that I've seen this do is it unlocks strategy at the highest level. We're talking, CEO board level, to your business strategy, your purpose, your brand, product innovation, service innovation, experience innovation, because you deeply understand what it means to be relevant in people's lives today. And if there's one thing I'm incredibly passionate about, is the power of thick data and these deep human truths being prioritized for strategic competitive advantage in business, so that we're all building businesses that do make life better for people. At the end of the day, when we're making life better for people through the products, the services, and all the arenas of life, as Mikkel talked about, Lego in the areas of play, Netflix in the areas of entertainment, automotive, how do we eat, care, drive, play, prosper with financial services, all of our businesses, it doesn't matter what sector you're in. What you're really in is how your business is meaningfully contributing to people's lives. And when you do that better, faster than your competition, you will win. But it takes the power of really fusing deep, the power of big data that gives you the scale and the confidence with the rigor and the depth of understanding that thick data and human truths brings. YJ, does that help?
Yeah. Thank you, Laura. And when you answered the question, you mentioned about working with the C-level executives. Yeah. And I'm very curious, this question is to you and also Mikkel too, is that, a lot of times big corporations, executives are very much drawn to big data and data which is tangible, which is in numbers. So when you work with them, they might have a doubt about the thick data, because thick data, as we looked at, collect data from a very handful number of people, although we go deep. But for the people who are accustomed to the big data, it might be the statistical error we are talking about, because we are just interviewing or living with the 10, 20 families, and maybe Lego case, talking with the kids, maximum 30, 50 people. So how do you talk with the C-level executives, and what are the initial discussions you have, and how you actually overcome those doubts about the thick data? Laura, maybe you can go first, and then we can go.
Perfect. Definitely, when speaking with C-suite, most senior executives, what I find is, sadly, all too often, people probably like myself, anthropologists like YJ and Mikkel, like in many cases, I find they bring you in when something's gone wrong or they're losing share. I can't help but reference when I see Lego. It's like it's gone on for so long, and they've had multiple departments and multiple their research teams, their analytics teams. Everyone's looking at it from a different perspective. So candidly, very often I do see the C-suite calling us in when there is a moment of we need to unlock growth. We need to turn this around. We need to enter a new market. We need to win with a new generation. If we miss this generation, we miss, the marketplace. So very often it's usually in a moment of like the business, they can't crack why or how to unlock the next growth chapters in their business. What I will also say, though, is it's not only when businesses are challenged, it's also the most phenomenal partners I've had the opportunity to work with are the leaders who recognize the importance of leading from ahead. So when their business is at the top, when they're thriving, and they don't take their their foot off the gas of like, okay, how do we unlock the next chapter? How do I really set my business up for its future success? So it is both. And I'll be honest, I'm happy to work with, in both perspectives. Sometimes it's when you're struggling or something's gone wrong and you're trying to figure out why. And the really also great C-suites that want to go from strength to strength. They want to understand what's my next future. Where's the emerging behavior? What's next around the corner? How do I see around the corner? And that's also when they bring you in.
That's very interesting. How about Mikkel?
Well, I want to echo what you just said, Laura. I think we very often see this, like when executives look at the numbers and you just have this sense that this doesn't tell me everything I need to know. I still don't get it. But when I try to explain that to folks, particularly the folks who are perhaps further on the spectrum of wanting math, wanting numbers, wanting sort of classic data to back up their arguments, I remind them that you can also look at the math of thick data, and you can look at thick data as math. So if you look at any data set, and you can have a data set of 1 million people, and you have 10 variables. Maybe you have 100 variables. Maybe even 1,000 variables. Great. That's a big data set. So for each person, that means you have somewhere between 10 and 1,000 data points. What thick data is simply that you flip those two numbers. So you might have 100 people, but you have 1 million data points on each person. You understand their entire lives. So it's no less extensive. It's no less. It has no less sort of power in explanation. It's simply that you're flipping whether it's the number of variables or the number of people. So that's the first piece. The second piece is then a lot of executives will say, okay, great, but isn't this something that we all know? Like, isn't it simply what you did with Blizzard, where you just say, okay, great, as an executive, I just need to use my own gut feel sometimes. I get it, like thick data, gut feel. I get it, we should do that. And again, for me, math is a good corollary. If you're an executive, it's helpful to know math, right? We can all agree it's helpful to be able to read a balance sheet, it's helpful to be able to make some projections and so on. But you don't necessarily need to be a data scientist and the most advanced mathematician in the world, right? And the same is true for thick data. So you can use your gut feel to sort of say, hey, something's off here. You can use your gut feel to say, I can also read the context and so on. But of course, dealing with thick data in a structured way, the way that a data scientist would deal with the mathematics, that requires specialists. So those two, again, I instead of thinking of thick data as sort of different from classic business and math, I think it's quite similar.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for great answers. So these days, the whole media and the environment is talking about AI and the big data and the ChatGPT. Obviously, there will be some areas where the big data might be more relevant and helpful, but there might be some areas where thick data needs to be really looked at. So any of you can tell us about where are the areas where especially the thick data and finding out the thick data is very critical?
I'm thinking about in this era, as we all move into this AI, increasingly more automated era in our businesses and in our lives, the importance of thick data, deep, qualitative, human truths understanding of your customers cannot be underestimated. Because I actually think the more we start to automate our business, linking data straight to action in the marketplace, the more it distances us from that instinct that deeply connects us with our consumers at large, who are your next growth targets to win with or attract, or your customers today. So I actually think it's really powerful. I'm actually really encouraged to hear all of you are engaging and connecting. You're talking thick data at the same moment you're talking AI and the future, because I couldn't argue more enthusiastically, they go together. And in fact, the more we automate with AI, the more I believe every executive's agenda should include how are you deeply operationalizing empathy in your business across the enterprise, not to the insights department, not to just the marketing department or the insight that lives in silos. Where AI is going to dynamically take our business is enterprise-wide, linking our ability as businesses to sense and respond really dynamically to the marketplace. It's only going to get faster. The demands and pressures and the abilities of our businesses to respond. That means as the leaders of those businesses, responsible for creating the products, the propositions, the experience, we have to have that human instinct and that connection and intimacy with our customers to understand why, what's working, what's not. So I actually think the more we dive into AI and the more it takes off, the increasing importance at the most senior levels of every leader has the power of thick data also in their strategic advantage.
Thank you, Laura. Mikhail, you want to say something?
I completely agree. I'll just add two ways in which the sort of AI world is also changing my world, changing the thick data world, I think.
Yeah.
The first one is, I spend a lot of time working with folks who are building foundation models. And it's interesting because I think there was a time years ago where the whole narrative was, how can we get more data into these models? More data, more data, more data. We can scrape the whole internet and so on. Right now, that conversation is shifting. So now increasingly there's a focus on how can we get small samples of extremely high quality data that we fully understand all the whole context around, and how can we make sure we can train our models on that? So for instance, when you're building technology for AR glasses, or when you're trying to train models on autonomous vehicles or something like some of these things, building the highest quality small data set that combines big and thick data, where the data scientists who are working with this fully understand not just the numbers on the screen, but also the context around the numbers on the screen. That's increasingly the sort of conversation, you could say, in Silicon Valley. And that was a little surprising to me. So that's something that we're now sort of pulled into and doing a lot of work in that field. So there's sort of a new way in which with AI, thick data and big data is sort of automatically meeting. And then I guess the other side that I'll point out, and this is more something that I'm still grappling with because it's reasonably new, is because of generative AI, you now also have the advent of synthetic data. So basically, the ability of computers to mimic more or less real people, right? To talk like a real person, to interact like a real person, and so on. And that means that there's sort of a debate right now going on that says, like, okay, so is this actually thick data at scale that we can just create Like that would be amazing, right? Wouldn't that be incredible if we don't even have to go and talk to real people? We can now just, create simulated people, and we can talk to them. And it's a space that I think is incredibly exciting because on one hand, I actually do think there's a lot you can do there to now scale thick data in new ways. So you can build a small sample of folks that you know extremely well and basically sort of replicate them and allow an organization to interact with that small group of people over and over again. So, if I've spent a couple of days with YJ and really understand him in depth, there might still be questions I didn't ask him that I don't fully know, but I can build a simulated version of him that I can ask those questions to. So I actually think that's incredibly exciting. I think it's also incredibly dangerous because the chances of that becoming just a source of misinformation and sort of AI feeding AI is very, very high. So it's a space that I think we haven't figured out what the right way forward is with, and it's something I'm deeply engaged in.
That's very interesting, and also very scary in some sense. Okay, I think we had a very exciting discussions, and unfortunately we don't have enough time to continue. But as a wrapping of comments, Laura and Mikhail, any final comments to the audience who are starting to understand tech data and getting interested in the tech data? Laura, you want to go?
Yes. What I would absolutely encourage and applaud everyone is get curious and put thick data and this qualitative understanding all the way into your business strategy at the highest level. Particularly as we move into this AI increasingly automated era, I cannot stress enough, I don't think it's optional for us. I think it's highly strategic, and it is one of the greatest sources of competitive advantage for your business going forward.
Thank you. Mikhail?
Yeah, and I guess I'll also just end on the same note. I think the more advanced our technologies all across the world get, and the more advanced technologies you're dealing with in your company, the more you need a deep understanding of the people who use that technology and that technology is for. So I see it as sort of a very linear relationship between the advancement of technology and the advancement of our understanding of human beings. Now, the problem is that very often we don't treat it like that. We treat it like, let's just put all the chips on technology, and humans, we sort of got them figured out, so we can stick with that. So I guess my advice would just be treat the understanding of people as a science. It is a science, so treat it as that.
Thank you, Mikhail and Laura, for great discussions, and thank the audience because I was observing you guys. Nobody was sleeping during the session. Kudos to you guys. Thank you very much, and have a great day today.